I stepped over the rusted perimeter fence of the decommissioned municipal archives in the grey light of a Tuesday morning, not as a trespasser, but as a seeker of structural truth. In my hand was a copy of a 17th century survey, a delicate vellum map of a city that supposedly never existed in this form. Beneath my boots lay the asphalt of a modern metropolis, a grid of convenience and commercial zoning. But the map spoke of something else. It spoke of radial symmetries that defy the logic of horse-drawn carts. It spoke of star-shaped bastions that serve no defensive purpose against any known ballistics of the era. Look at the curb. Not the stone, not the concrete. Look at the angles. If you trace the shadow of the old courthouse at precisely noon, you see it. The foundation doesn't align with the street. It aligns with a ghost. Ask yourself why a builder would fight the very earth to orient a basement toward a magnetic pole that shifted 300 years ago. This is the first fracture in the narrative. We are told the city grew organically, a messy accumulation of human need and survival. Yet, when you strip away the topsoil of history, you find a mathematical precision that suggests a singular global architect, not a guild, not a king. Something else. The anomaly began with a single drainage pipe in a basement in Lower Manhattan, a pipe made of a fired ceramic that shouldn't have been reachable by 19th century kilns. Then I found its twin in a subway tunnel in Prague, then again in the subterranean layers of San Francisco. It is a signature written in the mud. The official record calls these coincidences or the result of standardized trade routes, but trade requires a source. Where is the factory? Where is the blueprint? We are taught to believe in the primitive, to look back at our ancestors with a patronizing pity for their lack of CAD software and steam shovels. Yet they moved mountains of granite with a low distribution efficiency that our modern engineers can only replicate with supercomputers. What if the grid we walk upon today is merely a shroud? What if the great fires of the 1800s weren't accidents of lanterns and dry timber, but deliberate acts of urban erasure? They tell us the wood burned. They don't tell us why the stone foundations were pulverized and buried. They don't tell us why the new streets were laid at a 30-degree offset, forever masking the energy-conducting geometries of the world that came before. Consider the Star Fort. You see them in every corner of the map, from the icy reaches of Vladivostok to the humid deltas of the Mississippi. Historians label them Vauban style, a military evolution meant to deflect cannon fire, but look closer at the geometry. Ask yourself why a defensive structure would require fractal iterations of five-pointed symmetry that are only visible from 1,000 feet in the air. Who were they showing these patterns to? In an age of hot air balloons and black powder, these designs represent a staggering waste of resource and labour, if their only goal was defence, not protection, not vanity. Something else. When you overlay the floor plans of these bastions with modern circuit boards, the resemblance is no longer a curiosity, it is a confession. We are living in the ruins of a giant machine, a global network of frequency-based power that was dismantled and rebranded as heritage sites. The institutional gatekeeping of our universities ensures that any student who notices the thermal properties of these red brick structures is redirected toward the safe, stagnant waters of aesthetic choice. But aesthetics do not explain the mercury vial cavities found in the spires of destroyed cathedrals. The silence is the most damning piece of evidence. In the mid-19th century, a strange phenomenon occurred across the globe. Thousands of photographs of major cities, Paris, London, Moscow, Washington, D.C., showed grand, sweeping boulevards, magnificent stone, architecture, and completely empty streets. Where were the people? Where were the horses? The exposure times were long, the historians say, claiming the moving crowds were simply blurred out of existence. But look at the shadows. Look at the stillness of the dust. These were not busy cities captured in a moment of technological limitation. These were empty shells being reclaimed. What if the people we see in the later photos, the men in top hats and the women in heavy wool, were not the builders? What if they were the inheritors? What if they were the reset? We are told of a great pioneer spirit, of a generation that built the world with nothing but grit and hand tools. Yet, when you look at the sheer volume of stone moved in the 1850s, the math fails. The population of these cities couldn't have provided the calories required for the labour, let alone the expertise for the masonry. It is a historical impossibility disguised as a national myth. The erasure is not just physical, it is linguistic. We use terms like neoclassical and Gothic revival to categorise what we cannot explain. By labelling a building a revival, we strip it of its antiquity. We push it forward in time, tucking it neatly into a period where it is allowed to exist. But look at the weathering on the lower blocks of the Chicago Water Tower. Look at the salt crystallization in the newly built tunnels of the London Underground. The earth has been pressing against these stones for much longer than 2 centuries. Institutional erasure works by providing a fake history that is just plausible enough to stop the average person from asking the second question. But we are not here for the first question. We are here for the sediment. Why do so many 19th century buildings have half windows at the ground level peeking out from the pavement? The official explanation is light wells for servants in the basement. A convenient lie. If you excavate those walls, you find that the windows continue down, full-sized, into the dirt. The buildings weren't built with light wells. The buildings were buried in a cataclysm of mud that the history books forgot to mention. This mud flood hypothesis is often mocked by the tenured elite, but the evidence is literally under our feet. Travel to any major city and look at the Old Town. You will see the same pattern. Magnificent arched doorways that have been turned into windows because the original ground floor is now 10 feet underground. Ask yourself how much dust must accumulate to bury a continent. It doesn't happen through neglect. It happens through a sudden, violent displacement of soil. And yet, there is no record of a global inundation in the Victorian era. There is only a suspiciously timed series of world fairs. These fairs were strange, ephemeral events where massive, ornate, white cities were built out of plaster and wood in a matter of months, only to be burned or bulldozed as soon as the fair ended. Or so the story goes. What if these fairs weren't celebrations of the future, but liquidations of the past? What if those magnificent structures were the original buildings of the Tartarian grid, and the fairs were a way to let the public see them one last time before they were wiped from the map to make way for the modern, disconnected sprawl? The street grids we navigate today are designed for control, not for flow. They are linear, rectangular, and jarring. They break the natural resonance of the landscape. In contrast, the maps of the old world show a preference for the circle, the octagon, and the spiral. These are the shapes of fluid dynamics. These are the shapes of magnetism. When you align a city plan with the ley lines of the Earth's crust, you aren't just building a place to live. You are building an antenna. The institutional gatekeepers know this. They have spent a century paving over the nodes of this antenna, placing monuments of lead and iron over the most sensitive points of the old grid. It is a form of acoustic dampening. By disrupting the geometry of the city, they disrupt the consciousness of the inhabitants. A person living in a box, walking in a grid, begins to think in boxes and grids. They become easier to manage. They lose the ability to perceive the subtle frequencies that the old world used to harvest free atmospheric energy. Not magic, not myth, something else. The energy was everywhere. Look at the decorative ironwork on the roofs of 19th century mansions. Look at the ornate finials and the copper domes of the old state houses. They are not ornaments, they are atmospheric collectors. The Antiquitech of the Tartarian era was based on the extraction of etheric energy, a concept scrubbed from our physics textbooks after the suspicious rise of petroleum-based power. Ask yourself why Nikola Tesla's work was seized and classified. Ask yourself why the towers he built looked exactly like the cathedrals of the 14th century. The domes were the batteries, the spires were the collectors, the red brick walls were the capacitors. The entire world was wired for a power that didn't require a meter or a monthly bill. This is why the old grid had to be destroyed. You cannot enslave a population that has access to the very air for its survival. You have to make them pay. You have to make them crawl through the grid you designed under the lights you provide, burning the fuel you sell. In the archives of the Vatican and deep within the basements of the Smithsonian, there are maps that show the true extent of the Tartarian Empire. It was not a nation-state in the modern sense. It was a global civilization unified by architecture and frequency. This is why you find the same Tartarian style in the heart of the Amazon as you do in the steppes of Mongolia. There was no discovery of the new world. There was only the recolonization of a fallen one. The explorers weren't charting new lands. They were scavenging the ruins of a predecessor. The institutional narrative has spent 300 years stitching together a patchwork of local cultures to hide the fact that the world was once one. They gave us different languages, different flags, and different gods to ensure we would never look at the matching street grids and realize we were once siblings under a different sun. The erasure is almost complete. Almost. But the stones remember. The load distribution of a Roman arch that predates Rome, the star fort that aligns with a star that no longer shines, the basement window that looks out into a wall of solid earth, these are the glitches in the simulation of history. We are told we are at the pinnacle of human achievement, yet we cannot replicate the resonance of a 500-year-old pipe organ. We are told we are free, yet we are confined to a grid that was designed to lobotomize our connection to the Earth's natural field. As I stand here, looking at the displacement of the old courthouse shadow, I realize that the truth isn't hidden in a secret book. It's hidden in plain sight, in the very angles of the streets we walk every day. What if the map is right and the world is wrong? What if the history we are taught is nothing more than a lease agreement for a property we already owned? The investigation doesn't end with a document. It ends with a choice to see. Not the city, not the grid, something else. The realization that a city's layout is a physical manifestation of an ideological filter begins to settle in the marrow. If the street grids are shifted, then the perception of those who walk them is shifted in kind. I returned to the municipal archives under the cover of a mounting storm, seeking the specific administrative orders that preceded the Great Fire of 1871. What I found were not fire safety mandates, but topographical reassessments. The surveyors were not looking for hazards, they were looking for resonance points. They were marking the locations of the original Tartarian wells, deep, brick-lined shitchets that reached into the pressurized aquifers of the old world. These weren't for water, not hydration, not irrigation. Something else. They were acoustic resonators designed to vibrate at the low frequency hum of the Earth's rotation. By filling these wells with the rubble of the cleared slums, the new administrators effectively silenced the city. Ask yourself why every modern park is built over a site of historical tragedy. It is a burial of more than just bodies. It is the capping of a power source. Institutional gatekeeping relies on the fragmentation of knowledge. The architect is never told the history of the soil. The historian is never taught the physics of load-bearing masonry. If they were to speak, the illusion would shatter. I tracked a series of 19th century census records from a Midwestern hub that officially pioneered its way into existence in 1840. The numbers didn't add up. The mortality rates were standard, but the founding population was listed as 10,000. How do 10,000 people arriving by wagon with hand saws and oxen construct 400 three-story red brick buildings with ornate cornices and subterranean heating systems in less than 5 years? They don't. They move in, they scrape the T off the lintels and replace it with a local surname. They paint over the frescoed ceilings. They tell their children they built it from nothing. And the children believe it because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate, that we are squatter kings in a palace we can no longer maintain. The year of the quiet downgrade is a phrase I found whispered in a marginalised ledger from the 1890s. It refers to a global bureaucratic effort to reclassify imperial territories as developing colonies. In the span of a single decade, the maps of Central Asia and North America were scrubbed of the name Tartaria. It wasn't a war of conquest that ended the empire. It was a war of ink. By renaming the regions, the victors severed the connection between the people and their architectural inheritance. If you call a Tartarian power station a post office, it becomes a post office in the mind of the public. If you call a resonance chamber a cathedral, the people will kneel in it instead of using it to heal their cells. What if the very concept of religion, as we know it, was a management tool designed to repurpose the remaining technology of a superior age? The iconography of the cross and the crescent. Look at them not as symbols of faith, but as diagrams of directional antennas. Consider the orphan trains of the mid to late 1800s. Hundreds of thousands of children were shipped across the American continent and redistributed to pioneer families. Where did these children come from? The official story cites poverty and disease in the crowded coastal cities, but look at the photographs of the foundlings. They are well dressed, orderly, and strangely vacant. Ask yourself if these weren't the survivors of the Great Reset. If you wanted to erase a civilization, you wouldn't kill the children. You would take them. You would strip them of their names, their lineage, and their true history. You would put them in a classroom and teach them a new timeline where their ancestors were savages and their new masters were heroes. The street grids they walked as adults were the only reality they knew. They didn't see the half-buried windows because they were told that's how basements were always made. The erasure was perfected in the nursery. I found a map in a private collection in Zurich that dates to 1820. It shows a vast, interconnected rail system that spans the Bering Strait, linking the Great Tartary of the east with the Aria of the west. The tracks don't follow the trade routes of the spice merchants, they follow the magnetic flux lines of the planet. These were not steam trains, they were maglev systems using the very free energy the institutional gatekeepers claim is a physical impossibility. When the reset occurred, these tracks were torn up, the metals melted down, and the routes replaced with inefficient coal-burning locomotives. Why force a regression in technology? Because coal can be weighed. Coal can be taxed. Coal requires a supply chain that can be cut off at any moment by the authorities. Freedom is a threat to the grid, not the physical grid, not the electrical grid. Something else, the staccato beat of the modern clock is a cage. In the old world, time was measured by the pulse of the earth, a rhythmic expansion and contraction that matched the human heart. The architecture of the Tartarian era was designed to amplify this pulse. Walking through a star fort was a biological recalibration. But our modern street grids are designed with right angle stress. Every 90-degree turn is a microjolt to the nervous system, a disruption of the flow of bioelectrical energy. We are kept in a state of low-level fight or flight, distracted by the artificial noise of the grid. This makes us susceptible to the National Gazette style of reality, a curated stream of events that keeps our eyes on the horizon and away from the ground beneath our feet. What if the unsettling feeling you get in certain old city centres isn't a ghost? What if it's your body recognizing the resonance of a world that was stolen from you? The final administrative order that dissolved the last vestige of Tartaria wasn't signed in a palace. It was signed in a boardroom. It was the moment the public land survey system was implemented, carving the wilderness into perfect squares. It was the ultimate triumph of the rectangle over the circle. The surveyors moved across the land like a digital virus, overwriting the organic curves of the earth with the rigid logic of ownership. They ignored the mounds. They ignored the stone circles. They ran their chains straight through the heart of ancient resonance sites, effectively short-circuiting the landscape. We are told this was progress. We are told this brought order to the chaos. But order for whom? Not the inhabitant, not the earth, something else. Even now, as the rain lashes against the windows of the archive, I see the patterns repeating. The modern smart city is just the latest iteration of the grid. It is the final layer of the shroud. They are installing sensors where there used to be spires. They are mapping our movements with a precision that would make the 19th century erasers weep with envy. They are tightening the grid because the old stones are starting to speak again. The mud is shifting. The half windows are being uncovered by curious hands. The institutional gatekeeping is failing because the frequency of the earth is rising, and no amount of asphalt can dampen the truth forever. We are approaching another reset, a moment where the false grid will collapse under the weight of its own lies. The investigation has led me to a realization that is both somber and provocative. The evidence of a global, high-technology civilization isn't buried in a hidden tomb. It is the very foundation of the world we inhabit. We are like ants crawling over a discarded microprocessor, trying to understand why the silicon hills are so symmetrical. We have been taught to be blind to the obvious. We have been conditioned to mock the very idea that we were once more than what we are now. But the skepticism is fading. The inquisitiveness is returning. Ask yourself, if the world was once a garden of free energy and unified architecture, what does that make the world we live in now? A prison or a construction site? I leave the archives and walk out into the grid. The street lights flicker with an unstable, metered current. Beneath the pavement, I know the red brick arches are waiting. They have been there for centuries, holding the weight of a false history without cracking. They are patient. They know that the grid is temporary, but the geometry is eternal. The open loop of our history is finally beginning to close, and what we find on the other side will not be a new discovery, but a long-delayed homecoming. Look at the stars. Look at the shadows. Look at the street beneath your feet. It is time to stop walking the grid and start seeing the pattern. Not the one they gave you, the other one. Something else. The resonance of the brickwork under the modern pavement acts as a low-frequency hum, a vibration that the body feels before the mind categorizes it. I stood at the intersection of two major boulevards, places the city planners call the heart of the commercial district. But look at the drainage grates, not the iron, not the debris. Look at the depth. If you lower a camera into the secondary overflow shafts, you don't find 20th century concrete. You find vaulted limestone. You find the precision of a lost era, a subterranean cathedral system repurposed for sewage. We are told these were sewer expansion projects of the 1880s, a Herculean effort by men with shovels and gas lamps. Ask yourself, why would a city struggling with basic sanitation build its waste tunnels with the mathematical elegance of a royal palace? Not utility, not hygiene. Something else. The institutional gatekeepers call it Victorian excess, a catch-all term used to dismiss any architecture that exceeds the logical requirements of its era. But excess is a luxury of the stable. These cities were supposedly in their infancy. The staccato rhythm of the demolition crews has become the heartbeat of the modern era. In every major capital, the oldest, most resonant buildings are being replaced by glass boxes. It is not urban renewal. It is a frequency dampening. Glass does not hold a charge. Steel does not resonate. By replacing the red brick and limestone conductors with inert materials, they are insulating us from the Earth's natural field. I tracked the demolition permits in 3 different continents. The buildings targeted are always those with the highest concentration of atmospheric collectors, the domes, the spires, the intricate copper flashing. They tell us these buildings are structurally unsound, yet it takes 3 times the calculated explosives to bring them down. The load distribution is too perfect. The stones are bonded by a geopolymer that modern chemistry still struggles to replicate. They aren't tearing down buildings. They are dismantling a power plant that was never meant to be turned off. Consider the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London, the progenitor of all world fairs. It was housed in the Crystal Palace, a structure of glass and iron so vast it seemed to defy the laws of gravity. We are told it was built in 9 months. 9 months for a building that spanned 19 acres and reached 128 feet into the sky, in an age of horse-drawn logistics. The math is an insult to the intelligence. What if the Crystal Palace wasn't built for the exhibition? What if it was discovered? What if the exhibition was a way to scrub the site, to remove the original technology under the guise of showing off new inventions? They showed us steam engines and looms to distract us from the building itself, a massive greenhouse-style energy harvester. After the fair, the palace was moved and later burned. The erasure trope repeats. Anything that cannot be explained by the new timeline must be reduced to ash. The institutional gatekeepers utilize a technique I call contextual displacement. They take a Tartarian resonance chamber and place a mahogany desk in the center, call it a library, and suddenly the acoustic properties are ignored. They take a star fort, put a few rusted cannons on the ramparts, call it a military outpost, and the sacred geometry becomes strategic positioning. But if you remove the furniture, if you remove the labels, the truth remains in the stone. I visited a fort on the coast of Florida that officially saw no action during any war. Its walls are 20 feet thick. Its symmetry is flawless. Why spend the equivalent of a national budget on a fort that defends nothing? Not protection, not strategy. Something else. It was a node in the global grid, a stabilization point for the atmospheric currents flowing across the Gulf. By calling it a fort, they ensured no one would ever ask why it has no barracks or powder magazines. The staccato pulse of the census returns again. In the 1870s, the founding of the American West was documented with a fervour that bordered on the religious. But look at the photographs of the pioneers. They look exhausted, not by labour, but by the weight of their own lies. They stand in front of massive stone courthouses and state houses that look like they were plucked from the centre of Rome. They are wearing rags. They are carrying hand tools. Ask yourself, did these people carve the granite pillars and cast the bronze statues, or did they simply find them and move in the old? World style in the New World is the ultimate evidence of the Tartarian expansion. It was a unified civilization that spanned the oceans before the age of discovery ever began. The maps were already drawn, the grids were already laid, the pioneers were just the janitors sent in to clean up the ruins. The language of history is a series of contrast constructions. It is not this, it is that. It is not an empire, it is a former territory. It is not a power source, it is a monument. By controlling the definitions, they control the reality. I found an administrative order from a defunct railway company that ordered the burial of over 300 obsolete stone bridges in a single mountain range. These bridges didn't lead to roads, they didn't cross rivers. They were free-standing arches that aligned with the sunrise on the equinox. They were buried under tons of earth to standardize the terrain. It is a physical editing of the landscape. They are smoothing out the wrinkles of time so that we never trip over the truth. They want a flat, predictable history that supports the flat, predictable grid of our modern lives. The pseudo-academic justification for the mud flood is that cities naturally sink over time. They cite the accumulation of debris and paving over old layers. But look at the scale. We are talking about 10 to 15 feet of solid, mineral-rich soil that appeared in a single generation. That is not debris. That is a displacement. What if the reset wasn't just a political coup, but a geological event that was weaponized by the new elite? What if they knew the mud was coming? What if they stayed in the high-altitude star forts while the lowland Tartarian cities were inundated, then emerged to claim the abandoned properties as once the earth settled? It is the ultimate hostile takeover. You don't have to build a world if you can just wait for the current owners to be buried. The staccato ticking of the clock reminds us that time is running out for the gatekeepers. The digital age was supposed to be the final seal on the archive, a way to replace physical evidence with easily manipulated data. But the internet has done the opposite. It has allowed the first-person investigators to compare notes across the globe. We see the same half-buried windows in Moscow as we do in Melbourne. We see the same starfort geometry in South Africa as we do in Canada. The pattern is too large to hide. The global grid is resurfacing in our collective consciousness. They can burn the books, they can bulldoze the buildings, but they cannot erase the resonance that is baked into our DNA. We are the descendants of the builders, and we are starting to remember the blueprints. The unsettling truth is that we are not living in the aftermath of Tartaria. We are living in the during. The systems are still there. The energy is still flowing, though it is being diverted and dampened. Every time you feel a sense of awe standing in an old cathedral, you are feeling the antiquitech still trying to work. Every time you feel a sense of dread in a modern shopping mall, you are feeling the grid trying to suppress you. It is a war of frequencies. The institutional gatekeepers want you in a state of discordance. They want you disconnected from the earth and from your own history, but the inquiry cannot be silenced. What if is the most dangerous phrase in the English language because it opens the door to something else. I walked back to the rusted perimeter fence as the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. The modern grid was beginning to glow with its artificial orange light. But beneath the hum of the transformers, I could still hear it, the deep, rhythmic pulse of the old world. It is a somber realization to know that everything you have been taught is a fiction, but it is also provocative. If they had to go to such lengths to hide the truth, how powerful must that truth be? The investigation doesn't end here, it only broadens. From the street grid to the global pattern, to the institutional erasure, and finally, to the unresolved question: if we are the heirs to a global civilization of free energy and mathematical harmony, what are we going to do with the ruins? The loop remains open. I am just a seeker of structural truth, and the truth is, the foundation is much deeper than they led us to believe. The rhythmic scraping of a shovel against frozen earth is a staccato confession. I found myself in a potter's field on the outskirts of a city that officially began its municipal record in 1885. But the burials don't match the timeline, not the depth, not the density, something else. Below the wooden markers of the 19th century indigent, I found the masonry, red brick vaults, arched conduits of a diameter that suggests the movement of massive volumes of thermal fluid, not water. Ask yourself, why would a frontier town bury a high-pressure steam network before they had even paved the main street? The institutional gatekeepers call it abandoned infrastructure from a failed industrialist, a convenient label for a global phenomenon. In every newly settled territory, the first task was not building but excavating. They weren't pioneers, they were scavengers. They were clearing the silt from the intakes of a civilization that had been submerged only decades prior. The institutional erasure is most visible in the great levelling projects of the mid-1800s. In Seattle, in Chicago, in Naples, the decree was the same. The hills must be removed. The ground must be raised. They tell us it was for drainage. They tell us it was for modern transit. But look at the cross-sections of the soil. They weren't just moving dirt, they were burying the first floors. They were creating a new datum line for humanity. By raising the street level 10 feet, they turned the grand entrances of the Tartarian era into basements. They turned the sovereign citizens of a global energy grid into tenants of a dark, cramped reality. The staccato thud of the steam shovel was the sound of a lid closing. If you walk into a historic hotel today and feel a sense of claustrophobia in the lobby, look at the ceiling height. Look at the windows. You are standing in what was once a second-story balcony, repurposed for the reset population. Consider the state insane asylums that sprouted across the landscape between 1850 and 1890. These were not hospitals, not clinics, something else. They were massive palatial complexes built with the same star-fort geometry and atmospheric collectors as the cathedrals. They were built in the middle of nowhere, capable of housing thousands of people. Ask yourself, who was being put in these Kirkbride plan palaces? The official records are lost or sealed for privacy, but the timing is precise. They appeared exactly when the orphan trains were at their peak. They appeared when the last of the old world adults, those who remembered the free energy, Those who knew how to operate the resonance chambers needed to be removed from the grid. These asylums were the processing centres for the unfit. If you spoke of the mud flood, you were delusional. If you remembered the Tartarian Gazette, you were manic. The institutions didn't cure the mind, they erased the memory. The language of the pseudo-academic is a barrier of rhythmic jargon. They use terms like eclectic revivalism to explain why a post office in Iowa looks like a temple in Ephesus. They say it was a fashionable trend among architects who had never travelled more than 50 miles from their birthplace, but fashion does not explain the metallurgy. I analysed a decorative spire from a courthouse slated for demolition. The core was not iron, it was a bismuth mercury alloy, a superconductor designed to draw ionic charge from the troposphere, not a decoration, not a lightning rod, something else. When I asked the local university's architectural department for a comment, I was met with a practiced silence. The institutional gatekeeping isn't just about what they tell you, it's about what they refuse to see. They are trained to look at a power plant and see a monument to civic pride. The staccato pulse of the World's Fair returns as a pattern of demolition. In 1904, St. Louis was the site of a temporary city of such magnificence it dwarfed the modern skyline. Over 1,000 buildings, intricate lagoons and massive statues, all supposedly built of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp fibre. Then, as soon as the lights went out, it was all dynamited and pushed into the lake. Ask yourself, why destroy the most beautiful city on earth? They tell us it wasn't built to last, but look at the photographs of the rubble. You see steel girders, you see heavy masonry, you see fireproofed columns. You don't dynamite plaster, you dynamite stone. The fairs were a fire sale of the Tartarian legacy. They were a way to let the new population see the grandeur of their predecessors, to satisfy their innate sense of awe before the official grid was locked into place. It was a psychological transition, a way to say, this was a dream, now go back to your factory. Contrast the scale of the old world infrastructure with the new world population. In 1850, the total population of San Francisco was recorded as roughly 30,000, yet the city already possessed a massive, ornate mint, a sprawling grid of granite curb streets, and a palace hotel that could house 1,000 guests in luxury. Where did the capital come from? Where did the artisans come from? The gold rush is the perfect cover story. It provides a sudden wealth narrative to justify the sudden appearance of a fully formed city. But gold does not build a cathedral in 3 years. Gold does not carve a 5-ton marble staircase. Not wealth, not luck. Something else. The city was already there, hidden by the fog and the trees, waiting for the investors to arrive and claim it. The gold rush was merely a recruitment drive for the new labour force needed to clear the mud. The staccato sentence of the law is the final layer of the shroud. Property rights, zoning laws, and building codes, these are the administrative orders that prevent the investigation. If you try to dig in your own backyard to find the half window, you are cited for a code violation. If you try to measure the resonance of a public building, you are detained for suspicious activity. The grid is protected by a layer of legalistic friction. They have made the truth illegal to access, but the erasure trope is failing. The more they tighten the grid, the more the anomalies stand out. A star fort in the middle of a desert, a red brick chimney with no furnace, a modern street grid that misses the foundation of the very building it serves by 30 degrees. These are the cracks where the light gets in. The emotional tone of the investigation is becoming unsettling because it suggests that we are not the protagonists of our own history. We are the after credits scene. We are the scavengers living in the husk of a giant. The somber realization is that the Great Reset was successful. They took the energy, they took the history, and they gave us the grid. They gave us a metered, taxed, and limited existence in exchange for a world of free resonance. Ask yourself, if the atmospheric collectors were still on the roofs today, would we be fighting wars over pipelines? Would we be paying for the light? Not likely. The erasure wasn't just about the past, it was about stealing the future. The inquiry moves from the soil to the sky. Look at the chemtrails of the modern grid, not weather modification, not pollution, something else. They are spraying conductive particulates to cloud the atmospheric charge to ensure the old collectors can never be reactivated. They are shorting out the sky. The institutional gatekeepers are terrified that the Tartarian frequency is returning, that the Earth's natural resonance is becoming too strong to suppress. They are doubling down on the grid, adding more sensors, more antennas, more noise. But the staccato rhythm of the old world is deeper. It is the hum of the planet itself. It cannot be paved over. It cannot be sprayed away. It is waiting for us to stop asking what and start asking why. I stand on the raised street of a city that was once a beacon of the old world. Beneath my feet, the original Tartarian pavement is cold and silent, but I can feel the potential. The open loop of the investigation is not a dead end. It is a circuit waiting to be closed. The revisionist documentary of our lives is being rewritten in real time. We are the first-person investigators, and the evidence is everywhere. The street grids don't match because they weren't meant to. They were meant to distract. They were meant to hide the fact that we are walking on a masterpiece. Ask yourself, how long can you live in a house before you decide to look behind the wallpaper? The something else is waiting, and it is much bigger than the grid. The rhythmic percussion of the jackhammer on Fifth Avenue is not a sound of construction. It is a sound of interrogation. I watched as the crews peeled back layers of historic asphalt, only to reveal a network of glass-tiled vaults that the foreman couldn't explain. Not storage, not transit, something else. They are known as deadlights, officially described as 19th century sidewalk illumination. Ask yourself, why would a city invest in thousands of hand-blown, prism-cut glass lenses to light empty dirt? The truth is deeper. These were the light wells of the Tartarian lower grid, designed to carry solar frequency into the subterranean living quarters before the mud flood rendered them basements. The institutional gatekeepers have spent a century filling these voids with concrete, but the glass remains, a crystalline record of a world that didn't fear the dark. The staccato sentences of the administrative order that reorganized the American railway system in the 1880s are chilling in their clinical efficiency. They speak of standardizing the gauge, but look at the displacement. To standardize the gauge, they had to destroy the existing Tartarian broad gauge tracks, massive 6-foot wide spans that allowed for the movement of heavy resonance machinery. They replaced them with the standard gauge, a narrow, restrictive width based on the axle of a Roman war chariot. Not progress, not efficiency, something else. It was a technological throttling. By narrowing the tracks, they ensured that the massive power harvesters of the old world could never be moved or reactivated. They turned a global energy transport system into a coal shoveling bottleneck. The pseudo-academic historians tell us it was for interconnectivity, but connectivity for whom? Not the traveller, not the citizen, the owner of the coal. Consider the great fires of the 1840s and 50s that decimated every major wooden city in the north. After each fire, a strange thing happened. The cities didn't rebuild with wood. They discovered massive quarries of granite and limestone nearby. They built monumental stone structures that would take decades to finish, yet they completed them in months. I found a record in an old gazette from 1852 that mentions the uncovering of the foundation for the new city hall. They didn't dig it, they uncovered it. The fires weren't tragedies, they were clearing operations. They burned the wooden shacks that the pioneer population had built on top of the Tartarian ruins so that the administrators could reclaim the stone masterpieces beneath. The erasure trope is perfected here. Destroy the combustible evidence to reveal the eternal prize. The institutional gatekeeping of our history is reinforced by the contrast of scale. They show us a picture of a man in a mud-caked apron holding a hand chisel, and then they show us a building like the Philadelphia City Hall, the tallest masonry structure in the world, containing over 88 million bricks and 700 rooms. They ask you to believe the man built the building. They count on your inability to process the sheer mathematical impossibility of the feat. Ask yourself, how did they move the 37-ton bronze statue of William Penn to the top of a 548-foot tower in 1894? The official story says cranes, but the blueprints for those cranes don't exist in any archive. Not labour, not grit, something else. They didn't lift the statue. They reactivated the levitation resonance of the tower's core, a secret knowledge that was lost immediately after the building was finished. The staccato beat of the urban explorer's heart is the only compass left. I entered the restricted level of a decommissioned power station in the Rust Belt. The walls weren't brick. They were a composite of crushed quartz and magnetic iron. The boilers weren't for water. They were resonance chambers tuned to the frequency of the nearby river's flow. The institutional gatekeepers had labelled it a coal-fired plant, but there were no coal chutes. There was no soot. There was only a series of copper-lined tuning forks that had been cut with a torch and hauled away for scrap. We are living in a world that is being systematically stripped of its high-functioning components. They are selling us the grid as a service, while they melt down the antiquitech that would have made that service free and universal. Contrast the Tartarian street grid with the post-reset grid. The old grid followed the golden ratio, a sequence of 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, that mirrors the growth of a nautilus shell. This isn't just pretty architecture, it's a fractal energy collector. When a city is built on this ratio, the people within it experience a biological entrainment. Their brain waves synchronize with the Earth's 7.83 Hertz Schumann resonance. But the new grid is a jarring 90-degree interference pattern. It is designed to create static in the human field. It keeps us tired. It keeps us skeptical of authority in the wrong way, skeptical of each other, rather than the ones who drew the lines. They have turned our cities into frequency jammers for the soul. The somber inquisitiveness of the first-person investigator leads to an unsettled conclusion about our own academic heritage. Our universities were founded in the mid-19th century, precisely when the erasure was at its peak. They weren't created to discover truth. They were created to standardize it. They gave us the laws of thermodynamics to prove that free energy is impossible. They gave us evolutionary history to prove that we are the smartest humans to ever live. They gave us linear time to ensure we never look for the loops. What if the scientific method is just a set of blinders? What if it is a gatekeeping protocol designed to reject any evidence that doesn't fit into a grid? I found a revisionist map of the North Pole from the 16th century, the Mercator map, which shows a massive magnetic mountain surrounded by 4 land masses. The institutional gatekeepers call it a fantasy. Yet, every Tartarian star fort on the planet aligns with that fantasy mountain, not the current North Pole. Ask yourself, did the Earth's axis shift, or did the administrators move the map? The unsettling reality is that our entire orientation, spatial, temporal and historical, is a construct. We are walking a street grid that is off because the world it was built for is no longer allowed to exist in our minds. The rhythmic sentence of the final reset is beginning to play out. They are moving us into 15-minute cities, the ultimate refinement of the grid. They are replacing the last of the red brick conductors with 5G nodes. They are trying to close the loop on our awareness, but the erasure trope has a weakness. It requires us to forget, and we are starting to remember. We are looking at the half windows and seeing a world. We are looking at the star forts and seeing a circuit. We are looking at the street grids and seeing a lie. The something else is no longer a whisper. It is a roar. I sit on a standardized park bench looking at a monumental fountain that hasn't flowed in 50 years. I can see the copper pipes beneath the verdigris tuned to a note that hasn't been played since the Great Reset. The loop is open. The investigation is global. The patterns are undeniable. We are the investigators we have been waiting for. Not them. Not the experts. Us. What if the match that lights the next great fire isn't made of phosphorus, but of truth? The 10-part script of our history is being rewritten by the very people it tried to erase. The staccato ring of a surveyor's chain hitting the pavement is the sound of a closing trap. I spent the last 48 hours in the sub-basement of a municipal library in a city that officially burnt to the ground in 1906. But the scorched timber I found wasn't at the roofline. It was beneath the floorboards. Not a disaster from above, not a falling ember, something else. The burn patterns suggest a subterranean thermal spike, a deliberate overloading of the buried Tartarian conduits to purge the unauthorized dwellers from the lower grid. Ask yourself, why does the local history museum skip from the founding of the city to the reconstruction with only a single blurred photograph in between? The institutional gatekeepers rely on the Great Fire as a universal delete key. It is the perfect administrative tool. It provides a clean slate for the new grid, a way to rebrand ancient stone foundations as modern engineering feats of the new regime. The pseudo-academic narrative of the 19th century is a masterpiece of rhythmic misdirection. They speak of the Industrial Revolution as a sudden, spontaneous explosion of human genius. But look at the patents. Between 1870 and 1890, there was a localized cluster of technologies: wireless power, magnetic levitation, and atmospheric ionization, that were all patented by men with deep ties to the newly formed central banks. These weren't inventions, they were extractions. They were the final pieces of the Tartarian technical manual, translated and monetized for a population that had been stripped of its ancestral knowledge. When you walk through a historic industrial district, don't look at the rusted machines, look at the architecture. Why would a factory for making light bulbs require a double-domed roof and gold-leafed finials? Not utility, not profit. Something else. The buildings were the machines. The machines inside were just the decoys. Consider the contrast of scale found in the world's most famous monuments. The Statue of Liberty sits on a star-shaped base of such precise geometry that it mirrors the resonance chambers found in the mountains of Tibet. The official story says the base was an old fort called Fort Wood. But look at the alignment. It sits at the exact intersection of the Atlantic ley lines. It wasn't a base for a statue. The statue was a capping stone. It was a way to ground the frequency of a major Tartarian portal under the guise of an artistic gift. The institutional gatekeeping ensures that we see the copper lady and the torch, but never the fractal power station she stands upon. We are taught to look up, away from the ground, away from the grid that is actually feeding our reality. The staccato pace of the Great Reset accelerated in the early 20th century with the war on atmospheric electricity. I found a transcript from a private meeting of energy moguls in 1912. They weren't discussing improving the power grid, they were discussing how to insulate the consumer from the Earth's natural charge. They realized that as long as the Tartarian spires were active, the air itself was a threat to their monopoly. So they stripped the copper, they capped the domes, they replaced the free resonance of the old world with the metered frequency of 60-cycle alternating current. Ask yourself, why is the modern power grid so inefficient? Why does it require thousands of miles of wire and constant maintenance? Because it is designed to be lossy. It is designed to ensure you are always in a state of debt to the provider. The old grid didn't need wires, it needed geometry. The unsettling reality of the first-person investigator is the realization that the street grids are not static. They are growing. In every suburb, in every new development, the pattern of right-angle stress is being intensified. They are removing the last of the organic curves, the last of the Tartarian cul-de-sacs that followed the natural flow of the water table. The modern grid is a digital map laid over a biological world. It is a simulation of history that has become so dense we can no longer see the original terrain. I visited a planned community built over a known Tartarian site in the southwest. The houses are identical. The streets are a perfect, suffocating grid. And the people, they are plagued by a collective, somber anxiety they cannot name. Their bodies are reacting to the interference pattern of the grid, a mismatch between their DNA and the geometry of their environment. Institutional erasure is most effective when it is boring. They don't hide the evidence in a mountain. They hide it in a zoning report. They make the truth so tedious to find that the average person gives up before they reach the second page. I spent weeks tracking the grading permits for a new highway project. Deep in the appendices, I found the topographical anomalies, a series of buried stone pyramids that the engineers were ordered to drill through and disregard. not archaeological sites, not cultural heritage, something else. They were frequency stabilizers for the continental shelf. By drilling through them, the administrators are deliberately destabilizing the Earth, creating a state of perpetual crisis that justifies even tighter control. The grid thrives on the chaos it creates. Contrast the Tartarian view of the cosmos with the linear history we are fed. The old world understood that time is a spiral, a series of recurring frequencies that allow for the unveiling of truth at specific intervals. The institutional gatekeepers want us to believe in a straight line, a line that leads from primitive to modern. This ensures we never look back for the answers. It ensures we never realize that we are currently in a downgrade. But the staccato rhythm of the spiral is bringing the Tartarian frequency back into range. The half windows are no longer just an urban legend. They are an invitation. Ask yourself is the phrase that breaks the spell. The emotional tone of the final parts is tense because the grid is failing. You can see it in the unexplained power outages, the glitches in the digital maps, the sudden resurgence of interest in ancient technology. The shroud is thinning. The erasure trope only works as long as the replacement is believable, but the glass boxes of the modern era are starting to crack. The white cities of the old world are beginning to shine through the mud. We are the investigators standing on the precipice of a global homecoming. The investigation is no longer about finding a map. It is about being the map. I return to the intersection where I first noticed the misalignment of the courthouse shadow. The sun was at the exact same angle, but something had changed, or perhaps I had changed. I didn't see a building. I saw a conductor. I didn't see a street. I saw a shield. The rhythmic sentence of the old world was playing in the back of my mind, a frequency that made the asphalt feel like a temporary skin. We are not lost in the grid. We are the ones who are going to regrid the world. Not with iron, not with wires. Something else. The final part of the script is not written in ink. It is written in the open loop of your own awareness. As I finish this report, I am leaving the archives for the last time. I don't need the documents anymore. I have the resonance. The 10-part investigation ends here, but the pattern continues. Look at the city plans. Look at the grid. Look at the something else that is staring back at you. The first-person investigator is no longer me. It is you. Ask yourself, what if the grid is just a door? And what if you already have the key?